Okay, I believe I have been promoted to be a panelist. That's at least what the program says. So I believe that we can start.
Yes.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you well, and thank you so much for joining us today. So I'll just give a brief introduction to everyone, and then we'll jump right in with you and Roman, if that works. Wonderful.
Yes,
so welcome everyone to our weekly series on civil society and Ukrainian resilience. I'm Sarah Wilson-Soki. I'm a political science professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. And along with Jeffrey Glenn, who works with the RPCV Alliance for Ukraine, Olga Nikolska of isar.ednannia, and Roman Oleksenko, our civic activist program manager and volunteer, we've organized this weekly speaker series to highlight Ukrainian experiences and work during wartime. We're enormously grateful to our sponsors, isar.ednannia, Honors Eurasia, the RPCV Alliance for Ukraine, and the University of Colorado Boulder. Our goal and our hope, as always, is to promote Ukrainian voices and the voices of people doing the important work on the ground in the country today. And we have with us today Yevhen Hlibovytsky, who will be in conversation with Roman Oleksenko. And so without further ado, I will turn this over to Roman and Yevhen to give them the benefit of the full time of this hour that we have today.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me well? All right.
Yes, I do.
Greetings, everyone. Today is Friday the 13th, which is kind of symbolic considering we're going to discuss the Russian soft power in Ukraine, in the United States, and around the world. I'm in dual role today, so I was asked to moderate the discussion, but also share my experience. But I'll trust Yevgen as a lead keynote speaker on this because he just gets it more than I do. Again, our guest today is Yevhen Hlibovytsky. He has many titles, and I'm not going to list them. What I respect Yevhen for is his ability to see emerging trends, patterns, threats, and recognize them, but also develop strategies to address those trends. And our topic today is soft power, Russian soft power in Ukraine, Russian soft power, propaganda, narratives, you may call it whatever you want. And before we begin, I'd like to start with the definition, the way Wikipedia defines it, of the soft power. So in politics, and particularly in international politics, soft power is the ability to co-opt rather than coerce, in contrast with hard power. It involves shaping the preferences of others through appeal and attraction. Soft power is non-coercive, using culture, political values, and foreign policies to enact change. I mean, I could only add to the culture, sports, language, religion in the context of Ukraine. But my question to Yevhen at this point is, hearing this definition, what would you add to this definition from the standpoint of Ukraine and Ukrainians in the present day?
I think I better turn on the mic before I start speaking. I think probably interpreting this definition would be a good idea. Countries that come from common past, regardless if that common past was a voluntary union or was a violent capture, like a bad family where one party abuses the other party. It's still common past. And that common past has common reflexes that people react to. So soft power is based on that. But soft power can also be based on expectations. And if we look at how Russia affects Ukraine with its soft power, it's doing it through the music that people in both countries grew up with, fairy tales that they feel knowledgeable of, the books that they've read. The soft power that the United States is spreading across the world is of a different kind. It's about imagination. It's about future. It's about things that we want. And Hollywood and rock scene and pop scene and social networks, they just do that. They allow people to have access to experiences that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. So I would say that the American soft power vis-a-vis Ukraine mostly was a carrot hanging ahead of you, in front of you, whereas the Russian soft power was mostly something that was about going back and about revisiting the experiences that were in the past, for the better or for the worse.
Thank you. And you've already mentioned Ukraine and the United States, and I'd like to remind that our topic today is to revisit Russian soft power in Ukraine, the United States, and around the world, with some emphasis, if we have the time, and I hope we will, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think the advantage that we have in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russian narratives, Russian propaganda, soft power, is that we can recognize Russian soft power before the rest of the world does. And this is something that we're trying to warn our allies for years, and to some success, but not as much as we hoped. But allow me to start with Ukraine. And Yevhen, I'd like to, when we planned this show, I was almost said show, but when we planned this event, my colleagues and I thought about, hey, let's have it more like a talk show format, like make more interactive, more personal, but at the same time, more meaningful. So, let me start with our personal experiences and look at the Russian soft power through our personal experiences. And you already mentioned music, fairy tales, books, and whatnot. But we, you and I are the same age. We're born in the same year in the Soviet Ukraine. Both of us have lived and studied in the US. And both of us have returned to Ukraine thinking that, that Ukraine has a prominent future. I think both of us, well, I'm pretty sure both of us have a family member that was born and used to live in what is now occupied Ukraine. Since you mentioned music, I think, I know both of us played in bands, and you played the drums in the jazz band, as far as I know. However, you were born in Lviv. I was born in Zhovtivody. I mean, at some point, people are going to laugh, those who are behind the screen. But Zhovtivody is a small Soviet town in the middle of nowhere in central Ukraine. And my experiences, I bet, were quite different from your experiences. I was growing up, as a child, believing in the Soviet Union, communism, and Lenin, and watched the Russian movies about World War II, which I used to call the Great Patriotic War. And I was like, looking back retrospectively, I was a child who was brainwashed by Soviet propaganda, by Soviet power. Now, closer to the late 80s, early 90s, I had no illusions about the Soviet Union anymore. But still, it took me a while to come to terms with the fact that I still have lingering myths that the Russian Empire, be it the Russian Empire or the Russian Soviet Empire, instilled in me without me realizing that. What was it like for you? Because you spent a lot of years working in media. How can you recap the Russian influences and Russian soft power between 1991, is when Ukraine got its independence, to the early 2000s? What some of the trends that you saw at the time, and when did you recognize those trends as the Russian soft power?
Well, I think the situation is even more sophisticated than that. Ukraine's fight at this point, it's one of the important dimensions is the anti-colonial dimension. And Ukraine is rising up against Russia, against Moscow as a metropoly. And that basically means that Ukraine rises up against the prevalence of Russian culture, of Russian language, of Russia being present in all walks of life. But at the same time, it might sound strange, but through the same colonial ways, the Western culture was disseminated. So for a lot of people in former Soviet Union, Moscow was not only the center of Russian oppression, but it was also the center of globalization. If you wanted to fly somewhere, you had to fly through Moscow. If you wanted to get, I don't know, the tapes of the Beatles, that Moscow would be the place where you could get it easier than anywhere else. If you wanted to get access to Western magazines or to Western books or to books in English language, Moscow would be the place to do it. My good friend, former president of Kyrgyzstan, Rosa Utunbayeva, who I spent hours and hours talking about this, was explaining to me that for the Kyrgyz, the country is basically squeezed between China and Russia. And as she was telling me, she was saying, look, Russia is the West for us. Because all of the new technologies, all of the Hollywood movies, everything comes through Russia. So for Ukraine, it took a while to establish its own direct links with the West. Or I would even say with the world, because it's not only with the West, it's also with the East, it's also with Japan, it's also with Korea, it's also with other countries, the countries, Turkey, Middle East, you name it. But Russia has taken advantage not only of promoting its own culture, promoting its own legacy, but also Russia has the access of disseminating and in certain way censoring the Western legacy. One of the things that is notorious, for instance, about Russian book publishing is that they publish Western books in incredible numbers. But a lot of these books the translations are actually altered to censor away things that are not pleasant for the Russian reader. And even very contemporary authors, like, for instance, Harari or, other Western intellectuals, were caught up in that. And knowingly or unknowingly, they were part of this ordeal where their books in Russian would actually not correspond with the same text, with the original text in English. And in some cases, that would be the condition for access to the Russian market. In some cases, that would be done just as a wild action, on behalf of the publisher. But this kind of shows how Russia works. It basically tries to control the channels. It tries to control the way, I would say, humanitarian heritage is disseminated, is available to the public, and then create the mixes that actually serve the political purpose. Now, Ukrainians have learned over the years to recognize that, and Ukrainians have learned over the years to understand what's happening. So Ukrainians have taken countermeasures. First of all, for instance, those would be limitations. Ukrainians would ban Russian publishers from Ukrainian market. Ukrainians would ban Russian television shows from Ukrainian television, from access to Ukrainian television. Ukrainians would limit the circulation of Russian performers, for instance, in Ukrainian show business.
Not to mention dubbing movies in Ukrainian, because for a while, if you go to the movies, all you get is the Russian language, not a Ukrainian language.
These things. Well, for instance, what would happen business-wise, Russian advertisement agencies would self-proclaimingly decide that they do not represent only Russia, but they represent all former Soviet Union. They would start taking money, for instance, for advertisement of something on the territory of the former Soviet Union, without actually making, forward payments to their Ukrainian subsidiaries, real life or imaginary. And a lot of Western companies would go for that. Corporations would pay these money, thinking that they actually work across the former Soviet Union. It took them years and years to build up their presence. Things like the language of the content in movie theaters, on television, on radio. It took years also for it to start turning towards Ukrainian language. So it was a very slow process. And I remember when I came to Kyiv, I moved to Kyiv from Lviv to the Ukrainian capital about 30 years ago. You could hardly hear any Ukrainian language on the streets, and if you would come into the office or into a shop, supermarket, and ask something in Ukrainian, people would look at you, would give you this glare, before they would respond, mostly in Russian. Now, I was getting here from one meeting to back to my office, and I was surprised that today was probably the day when I basically didn't hear any Russian language on the streets, and that happened very slowly, very naturally. And that was not a violent process. That was basically the social contract in Ukraine is live and let live. So that means that those Russian speakers who wanted to speak Russian, they can continue doing so. But the young kids actually go to Ukrainian language schools. They go through different schooling, and that's how change happens. But I think it's not Ukraine that's most vulnerable. But I think there are two other groups of countries, because you see, Ukrainians are acutely aware of the risks that Russia poses for Ukraine.
I thought we agreed that I can't interrupt you, and I would just let you go and forever. But before we switch to other countries, I still want to look, because we are talking about civil society's role in resilience and rebuilding of Ukraine. I don't know much, to be honest with you. I don't know much about the Russian soft power as it was manifested in Ukrainian CSO, civil society organizations, between 1981 and 2014, say. Do you know anything about this? Like, how did the Russians work through, fake NGOs, civil society organizations in Ukraine at the time, and how successful were they?
They tried and they failed. And the reason why they tried and they failed is because the civil society presence for the Russians is not a natural occurrence. Russia is a country that is very much built hierarchically top-down. Ukraine has been the victim of that. And the trauma of totalitarianism in Ukraine tells us that any strong government is a risk. We should keep our government weak. And this is something that kind of goes away from conventional wisdom in the West, that the government should be strong and capable. Ukrainians want the government to have limited abilities, because we have historical experience where our government, or not our government, but captured government, but still the government that governs us, would turn against the society, and that would cost millions of lives. So what Ukrainians do is they prefer to have a different setting, which is actually difficult for Europeans to understand. It's much more easier for the Americans to understand that. We actually want greater individual freedoms for the people, and we want a weaker government that runs things. And so whenever we hear about smart regulation or the Bruxellian way of doing things, I would say that for an average Ukrainian, that spells trouble. And so that makes all these civil society activities and volunteer networks all but natural for Ukrainians. But they're not natural for the Russians, because I would say that the mission of a self-conscious Ukrainian is a search for agency and a search for how can you...
It's funny that the United States, up until 2022, still believe in the Russian civil society and try to encourage and promote it.
There is no Russian civil society, because the mission of Russian is to play along the state and get as many benefits from the state while trading your agency to the state. So the Russians, and this is exactly the case. You see, the Russian opposition is not willing to fight for their own capacity for their own influence inside the Russian society. So when Ukrainians are telling to the Russian opposition that, look, this is your mess as well, you have to clean it up. Don't wait for someone to come from a third party or from the outside and clean up your mess. This is your country, And the Russian opposition at that point, they freak out. They just freeze, because for them the idea of agency is it's so forbidden. It's been persecuted so violently and cruelly for centuries and generations that even thinking about it is means overcoming a lot of fear. And for Ukrainians, agency is what we are looking for, and implementing our agency is what we are looking for naturally. So civil society is the lowest hanging fruit. Business is the other lowest hanging fruit. And this is why Ukrainian civil society and Ukrainian private business, especially small business, are so intertwined. Church is another low hanging fruit, because the other way how you can actually implement yourself in this life is through your parish, through your church community, through your church activity. And church has been the player that has never been on the side of the abuser, which is also different from churches in other countries, because historically we had other villains, and church usually was the one that was actually protecting the public, not being a coalition member of those who pose threat to the public. So in that sense, I would say that the civil society development is natural for Ukrainians, is natural for Ukraine. Ukrainians are living through a difficult period of time now, not only because of the war, but because the war also imposes the change of rules of the engagement inside the country. This is the time when government has to be very centralized, when the leader has to have delegated powers from the society in greater extent that Ukrainians usually do. And Ukrainians have done that. The institutional trust towards the balance of institutional trust, so that is the subtraction of those who do not trust from those who do trust. So the balance of institutional trust for the president of Ukraine has risen 92% between the moment the president, between the moment before the full-scale invasion and the moment after the full-scale invasion. So Ukrainians have transformed, they have done that, but we are far, far away, I think we're generations away from being confident that we have arrived to our own governance model that we like and that actually serves our purpose. It took the United States probably, I'm not sure if the United States have concluded their institution building. I think it's an internal process.
That's where I'm going to interject, if you will, and slowly transition to the Russian soft power in the United States and around the world. And I'll let you have a sip of water. Because you mentioned, Ukrainians have transformed before and after the full-scale invasion. And I want to see how the Americans have changed before and after the full-scale invasion of last year. And I'll give you a personal example. So I visited the United States twice shortly before the full-scale invasion of last year. And I remember I was with a group of Ukrainians, and I remember Americans looked at us, looked at me, and in their eyes I could read, hey, look, there's a dead man walking. And I could see that they were apologetic. They were sorry. They didn't think that they would see me again, knowing that, the Russian troops were building up along the border and that we're basically doomed. Now, fast forward.
We call that phenomena Kyiv in 3 days.
Yeah, yeah.
That is
Yeah,
part
exactly.
of the, Kiev should fall in 3 days, whatever, blah, 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 Yeah, we heard a lot
Exactly.
about that. Yeah.
Exactly. So fast forward, like in this year, April of this year, I happened to accompany another Ukrainian delegation to the United States. So that was my first time after that visit before the full-scale invasion. And I have to say that I was really amazed at not so much of support that we saw, the support for Ukraine. So it's not the people who talked and openly expressed the support for Ukraine, but it's people who didn't talk, who were there, who were present, but didn't say much. And one of such examples happened to us during our final day in America, as one of our American hosts who had been entertaining us the entire time, meaning driving us around, supporting us in every possible way. He was driving, and we're in the car, all of us, the mayors of 4 Ukrainian cities, including the city which is right in the combat area. And he started crying. He's like, I don't want you to die when you go back. You're so beautiful. I say, what do you mean? And he goes, I wish I had your belief in the United States. And when I asked him to expand, he said, well, the United States can never beat Russia on the battlefield, but America will find Russia to the last Ukrainian standing, that America and NATO were evil. They were guilty of all these crimes during the past wars. And when I told him, look, you sound a lot like Putin, and he's like, well, maybe he has a point. Bottom line, I had to eventually ask him who he voted for during the last presidential elections and who he was going to vote for in the upcoming elections. And you can guess the name. It's Trump. But what was an eye-opener for me at the time is that how fast the far right have transitioned to some of the far left narratives when it comes to American soft power projected to the rest of the world, including guilt trips for previous wars, including the imperial vestiges that they still have. I know you just came from America. You were just there like a couple of weeks ago, maybe a week ago. What have you noticed? What are your observations?
Well, I understand. I wouldn't blame only the Trump supporters, because there's been a lot of pro-Russian sentiment in the progressives, on the Democrat side. There have been quite a few, I would say, claims that the U.S. should be siding more with Putin on the intellectual sides. Some of the things are just appalling. There are people like Samuel Charep from Rand Corporation, who has been consistently wrong on everything he's written in Ukraine in the recent years, and he's still being employed by Rand, which
And
is kind of
he's a frequent visitor to all-day conference.
He's invited to conferences, and there are a lot of people like that. John Mearsheimer, there are many others. So Elon Musk, look what he's doing. There are a lot of people. They're not necessarily political activists. They can be part of the business community. One of the things that really shocked me, was I went to Ohio, and I went to university in Ohio. So I visited some of my classmates and some of my university friends, and I visited the university when I was in the US last month. I was driving through some of the rural roads in Ohio, and I was listening to one of the Christian stations. And I was shocked to basically hear the Russian narrative from the host of the Christian station, who was talking about a blank check being issued to Zelensky, and the U.S. Basically sending money uncontrollably to a country that persecutes Christians, and this was the whole Russian narrative, and this is exactly what my point is. We in Ukraine, being close to the threat, are acutely aware of the threat. We see the Russian propaganda, we can recognize it, we can identify it, and we can fight it. Not always as efficiently as I would like it, not always as well as, I would prefer it, but that's what we do. But a lot of people in the United States are not aware how much the troll farms, how much the voices that have been injected from the outside, especially now when you can employ a chat GPT, artificial intellect that would smoothly translate your Russian into good English and, put all of the tenses in the right way, and fix the grammar and, do all the other things. So a lot of people are not aware that the agenda that's being fed by the social media, that the way the algorithms work, and they offer divisive material because divisive material actually would be liked, shared, and that's exactly the kind of engagement that the social networks, the software wants from the user.
Yeah, divide and conquer. That's kind of been their kind of,
that eventually leads to very divisive agendas in real life, in political life, etc. There's little to balance it out with, because, for instance, on the European continent, there is a tradition of strong public service broadcasters, like the BBC, for instance, in Britain, or RD or CDF in Germany, or that actually can be unbiased and that can be that can be non-partisan. When you look at the American television stations, you understand how partisan they have become, and that used not to be the case, 20 years ago. They were leaning, but they were not that openly, basically positioning themselves as ideological platforms. So this atmosphere in which there is expectation of the ideological divide is extremely inviting for the Russian trolls, and they will not be selling Russia per se. They will not be saying, read Dostoevsky or learn Russian language. No. What they want is they want weak America. They want incapable America. So they basically, what they would do, they would promote infighting. They would promote the type of behavior that would make America incapable as an international player in the end.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
If I may, so for the sake of time, I put together like a list of the topics or narratives that Russian government promotes in the United States and around the world, really. And also I listed like the groups of or categories of citizens that these narratives sound really attractive, in my opinion, again. And again, it's the fear of nuclear war. I mean, you can have many Americans are afraid that the Russians will escalate and start a nuclear war. It's disintegration of the so-called Russian Federation, corruption in Ukraine. I hear that's one of the best things, one of the best narratives that therefore the Ukrainians should not be trusted with their weapons. Persecution of religious freedoms in Ukraine. And Carlson Tucker is the one talking about it all the time, meaning like the Russian Orthodox Church that is still, thriving in Ukraine, in my opinion. Ukraine is full of Nazis. NATO's aggressive expansion, and a lot of people say, hey, this is not what Gorbachev was promised back in the late 80s, which is not true. American imperial ambitions, and that works for both the far left and the far right. Rampant capitalism. Some people still believe that Putin is like anti-transnational corporations, and he's like the embodiment of the socialism. Degradation of family values. That's a big thing in within Russia, but I see a lot of sympathizers around the world who say, well, that we're all of these LGBT communities have to be blamed for the degrading moral values. and which is one of the pillars of the so-called Russian world. Western hypocrisy and betrayal of Russia, and there's a lot of talk about that. Putin versus good Russian people. That's kind of like a new narrative that emerged following the full-scale invasion. And also the biggest one is Russophobia. That word has become sort of like the key word that the Russian propaganda channel use all the time. You're Russophobic, you fear of us, therefore you should be punished. And I think, all of these narratives sound so appealing to a lot of people, especially if they're like NATO skeptics or EU skeptics, all kinds of environmentalists, not to say anything bad about them, neo-Marxist, various types of extremist groups. But I think what unites a lot of them, especially outside of the United States, is their anti-American sentiments. And like you said before, even the intellectuals have been known to have succumbed to the Russian soft power in this regard. Do you agree with me, or anything?
Oh yeah, I was interviewed. I was interviewed by a local paper in Lima, Ohio, which is a town of I don't know, roughly probably 100,000 people, which is one of the bigger, smaller cities in the Western Ohio. And by coincidence, it's close to the place where I went to college, but by coincidence, it's also the place where Abrams tanks are built in the United States, and Ukraine is acquiring these tanks. And so I was saying that, well, you see, this is also how the local community wins from a cooperation between the United States and Ukraine, because something will be produced, people will get their salaries, local economy will have its own better opportunities because of this. And and we're not even talking about cooperation in farming, drones, crop dusters and everything. I went to some of the county fairs to see, and the response to the interview was very angry one. People in comments were complaining that they don't have enough money, but millions are being sent to Ukraine. And one of the things that I think is important to do is to treat these complaints as real, because people are expressing their real pains. A lot of people that I see, including in the families of my friends, of people who have built betted their careers on, for instance, Detroit manufacturing, and then one day globalization took their jobs away just at the point when they were becoming career-wise vulnerable, when they were in their 50s or 60s, and they it would be difficult for them to retrain and have another career. And at a certain point, they fell into a populist trap because it seemed as an easy way out, and the Russians were happy to support it, not because they wanted a particular candidate in the office, but because they actually wanted this infighting, and they wanted, the more there is insurrection, the more there is infighting, the more there is the more there is mutual blaming, and the more there's turmoil, the better breeding ground, for the further opportunities it is for Russia. And it's not only Russia. I think the Chinese are also following attentively. The Iranians are also following attentively, probably not having quite the opportunities that the Russians are having. But this is how they work. So, they are using the real pains, the real fears that people have, and they're exploiting them. They're not offering a solution. They're not offering a real way out. They're not even trying. They don't care about that.
If I may, my observation also is like, ideally, I think, the Russian government is trying to make people believe in their story, in their narrative. But if you doubt about your own narrative, about your own soft power, is also good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a kind of no-lose situation for, from the investment standpoint, from the point of view of the Russian government. And in that sense, it's very difficult to explain that even though the pain is real, restraint sometimes is the best option, the best way to deal with. I'm sorry, but it's easy to say to someone, impose self-discipline upon yourself. I'm telling it myself all the time, and I don't follow. We are faced with our challenges in life that force us to feel the pain that sometimes we allow to overcome our rationale. And that's this is the envelope. This is where the Russians are playing, and they're doing it well. The other thing is the strategic influence, and that's a whole different game. There are several tens of thousands of professionals in the United States that are connected to Russian studies. University professors, political experts, economic experts, etc. These are the people who have been taught and have been raised as professionals in certain concepts. These concepts are, at this point, right now, they are challenged. And they're challenged by this war, they are challenged by the Ukrainians, but it's extremely difficult to abandon the usual way how the world has been seen. And, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the view of the former Soviet Union was still Moscow-centric. People would think that you can actually speak Russian everywhere without second guessing. People would consider that it's normal. The Moscow-centric approach was in a lot of dealings. I was buying a ticket on United Airlines website, and I was trying to pay for an upgrade with my credit card because I needed more luggage, whatever. I could not select a billing address because Ukraine is not present in the drop-down menu. Russia is present, but Ukraine is not present. And it's 2023, and it's United. It's a huge global airline, so there are a lot of things like that. Now what happens is that Russia has committed tremendous atrocities, these war crimes, Bucha, everything, it caused a backlash. And I can visibly see, for instance, in the American academia, a situation where a lot of people who have been in Russian studies are simply protecting their own careers at this point. And so we are looking for the vision of the end of the war, the vision of the end game of the war in Ukraine. And what Ukrainian experts are saying is that if you take it as a textbook example, that's going to be the collapse of the Russian Empire. So that means that Russia will fall apart. Some of the parts of Russia that are now integral parts of Russian territory will eventually secede. And there's
a scenario that people in the West are afraid of.
Not only afraid of, but also in denial that that's possible. And
like the
I haven't seen
the Soviet Union will collapse.
I was on one of the big Washington think tanks panel recently, on that topic, and this is the kind of situation when you're talking about that, the reaction on the American side is not arguments but laughter, and this is, I think, another blunder because we've been there. I think we are, relative to the collapse of the Soviet Union, probably reliving our 1989 moment, when the Soviet Union seemed that it's strong and it will never collapse. There's no way that can happen, you know. And I think we're reliving the moment, not that it must happen, but it is possible that it may happen. But a lot of the political thinkers, a lot of the scholars, a lot of the researchers, a lot of the analysts are actually defying the approach that would accept the possibility of such scenario, because in their eyes, Russia must always be there, and it must be great. It must be, you know, this source of kind of interesting, maybe a little Oriental kind of mysterious culture with, you know, Tolstoyevsky, with Bolshoi theater and everything, you know. And, you know, Fiona Hill, who's probably one of the most respected analysts in the United States, has been describing in her interviews how she was fascinated with this, you know. So this fascination is also part of the soft power that is employed right now in the United States. It's invisible because where in the textbooks where the Russian authors are, could have been other authors, you know, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Kazakhs, Tajiks, Georgians have had their own literary geniuses, you know, had their own great poets, had their own great contributors to global culture, but they never get the chance to get to the podium because of this Russocentric approach that's been developing through centuries, and that is very strongly built up into the modern American, modern Western system. Even to a greater extent, it works in what we refer to as global South.
Yevhen, I hate to interrupt you and stop you because we're approaching the hour. And I'd like to leave a chance for the audience to ask maybe 2-3 questions. But since I'm not seeing any questions, and I'll let Sarah tell us if there is or if there are, I think we promised the audience of just a little bit of our insight into how Russian soft power works in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Do you have anything to say about that? Maybe 1 or 2 minutes.
Well, first of all, is that there's enormous capacity in the troll factories. You know, we're talking about millions of accounts that are being programmed and that disseminate information, you know, and they are quite active. And when we see the fall of their activity, for instance, on the Ukrainian scene, we understand that they have been transferred somewhere, you know. We've seen the last 3 weeks have been incredibly quiet in Ukraine. We know from our experience that means that Russians are up to something. And now we see that Russia is clearly supporting Hamas in their narratives, and is basically what they need is they don't. It's not about Hamas winning. It's not about protecting Palestinians. It's actually about making sure that this conflict is so big that it overshadows what Russians are doing in Ukraine, and that it distracts, especially at the moment when the government in the United States is going through its own transition, its own transformation. There is no Speaker of the House. You know, the clock is ticking with the government shutdown. So that's
perfect chaos. It's a perfect chaos theory that they've been trying to promote. Yeah.
And they're taking advantage of that. They're taking advantage of that. So what they're trying to do is to make sure that the views are off, you know, what's happening in Ukraine, but also that there's too much the trouble for the United States, for the West, across the world, and they have their hands full.
Thank you, Yevhen. I think we have a couple of questions already. What do you see the way forward for countering Russian soft power around the world, including the United States?
Okay, well, I think that's a great question. What I think is that we need to rethink how the educational system works, how the academia works, how the think tanks work, how media works. So we basically, what it means is that it would be best to decolonize the system of approaches that the American institutions have across the world. Let me give you an example. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, other media have been for years, until probably the recent years, the very recent years, have been covering events in Ukraine from Moscow. So people who lived in Moscow, who didn't travel to Ukraine or rarely traveled to Ukraine, would write about things happening in Ukraine without the American audience being fully aware that these people are not able to grasp the fabric of society. I'm sorry, something happened to, I might have turned off the camera. Just a second. Let me try.
While you're trying, I'll give you some breathing room. So I remember just before the full-scale invasion, there was an article in New York Times written by, I think it was Mike Empok Big, saying that Ukraine and Russia, or it was Russia in Ukraine, the two founders of the Soviet Union are about to be at war with one another.
Mm-hmm. Well,
the Union.
It's not the case because actually Ukraine was not the founder of the Soviet Union. What happened? The Russians have crashed Ukrainian independence. They have created artificial Ukrainian entity, and together with the Russian entity, they formed the Soviet Union. So it's at that point, Ukrainian government had the agency of a hostage. It was not capable of representing the Ukrainian society. But I would say, going back to the question, I think there's a lot of work to do with the textbooks. I think there's a lot of work to do with how institutions work, especially in Washington. There's a lot of work to do in academia. There's a lot of work to do in business. There's a lot of Russocentric view. I think to an extent, this is not a new scenario. Something similar has happened to Asia. Back in the 70s, in the 80s, a lot of people would, for instance, refer to the countries that we now see vividly as separate entities as to generally Asia, And I remember probably about 15 years ago, a prominent magazine, Far Eastern Economic Review, went bankrupt exactly because of that. Because it was not, it wasn't about Far East anymore. It was about, a lot of separate entities that had required separate approaches. And I think the same thing is happening. I think that it's going to be more difficult to do because from what I sense is that the tendency inside the United States right now is closer to this isolationist side of the pendulum movement. I think it's dangerous to take for granted that strategic security that the United States enjoys because of its geography doesn't put certain obligation on the United States. And the US has found that obligation in the role of arsenal for democracy. And I think it's important that at least that role is being performed well. Because the worst thing that I've heard from the Ukrainian perspective is when the Ukrainians are turning to the Americans asking for shells or asking for certain military equipment. And what we hear in response is that we don't have enough for ourselves. that kind of puts us in a situation when we are really concerned.
Thank you, Yevhen. We have two more questions, and I believe those will be the last questions today. One question: how effective is Russian soft power in Ukraine today? Is it likely to play a role in dividing Ukraine after the war ends? And that's a really interesting question. And again, you just turned off your camera again, because the way after the war ends, I mean,
sorry, every time I go to read the question, I turns off the camera. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. But it's interesting how, like, every time, and it's kind of an instinct that I already developed. Like, every time I hear the phrase "the war ends," my follow-up question would be, with what and how? Like, well, like, but what's the Russians? How are Russian soft power doing in Ukraine right now, and what are the threats?
Okay, I think it's a curve, and I think right now the Russian influence is at the lowest point, because the pro-Russian core in the Ukrainian society is basically silenced, but also because the Ukrainians have learned to recognize the old tricks that the Russians have been using and have adapted to them. But the Russians are now using the new tricks. For instance, one of the things that the Russians have never done before, they've never spoken to Ukrainians in Ukrainian language. Now, with Google Translate and artificial intelligence that can do the translation, they are starting to promote their narratives in Ukraine through social media in Ukrainian language, which some Ukrainians have learned to detect it, but some Ukrainians still fall prey for that.
I even remember, if I may, I remember there was a festival, a celebration of the annexation of some oblast of Ukraine just a few months ago, and they they give the floor to the Ukrainian refugees that were living in Moscow, and they wrote a song in Ukrainian, with Ukrainian colors, and it was sung in Moscow, in the center of Moscow, in the stadium. But again, the words of the song alluded to the fact that
So there's a lot of that. I think it's a cat and mouse situation. The Russians, as long as they have the money to spend on that, so that means as long as we're still buying their goods and services, as long as basically the sanctions have a lot of loopholes and they're not enforced strictly, Russians will have the money to do that, and they will continue doing that. And I bet they will be working inside the U.S. before the presidential elections that are just giving them incredible game field next year. My wishes to my American friends, to people I love in the United States is, stay strong, be smart, and stay vigilant, because that's probably going to be one of those campaigns where the Russians will try to use most of the tricks that they've learned by this point.
I would only add exercise media literacy and use your critical thinking skills, because for years I've been told and I've been taught that we have much to learn from our American allies. And at this time in life, I realized that people are the same everywhere. It's just some societies, some countries go through challenging faster when it comes to realization of the external threats affecting them, as opposed to the others. So I think at this point, Ukrainians can offer a lot of insight into how to recognize Russian soft power around the world, and specifically in the United States, and effectively address it.
Well, for some reason, God placed us next to the Russians. So we now will try and do our best by serving the world with our experience.
And that's a great conclusion line. Yevhen, we approached the 6-hour point. I think we did very well in time. And I want to thank you profoundly for sharing your insights, for sharing your thoughts, observations. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for attending and me talking to the audience who came today. I know for a lot of folks, finding an hour in America in the morning during work hours is difficult, but I want to compliment you for finding the time and paying attention and asking questions, but also the Ukrainian audience on Friday evening. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the organizers, and Yevhen, keep up the great work. Thank you so very much today.
Thank you very much, and good luck.
Thank you so much, Yevhen, for joining today.